Now that the UK has triggered Article 50 to leave the European Union, there's growing speculation about the future relation between the two. But it also has significant implications for third countries, including the developing world. From a trade perspective, how is the global landscape likely to change?
Well, the big problem is indeed the uncertainty. So, in the sense that Article 50 triggers the negotiations between the UK and the EU on what will be their relationship between the two, and the kind of relationship the UK will have with the EU, trade relationship, will have an implication for third countries. And the way they will exit, whether there will be a trade agreement or not, is going to shape the outcome. And there the big concern is the UK would like to negotiate both the exits and the future trade relationship at the same time, but that will not happen. The EU is adamant to first settle the exit and then negotiate what will be the future trade deal. It's unlikely they'll manage to do that within 2 years.
There's a number of countries that have preferred access to the European market through economic partnership agreements, for instance. Are these agreements going to be still in place?
Well, the agreements that the EU has with third countries are still going to be in place. The big question for third countries and of course, big concerns for developing countries is whether they will still be able to have a preferential access to the UK. So that's one of the concerns, and that will depend on the UK trade policy. But that again cannot be done overnight, and that cannot be done until the UK has left the EU.
So is it likely that we will see a gap in trade in this transitional period?
Well, I think that's one of the concerns, that there will be no preferential trade regime in place for some developing countries. But in fact, the UK is working, and we know there are already discussions within the UK government about this transitional period and what is the regime they could be in place. What they want to avoid absolutely is that trade partners are left in limbo and not knowing exactly what would happen.
So concretely, for countries that are having an EPA, an economic partnership agreement with the EU, how is the situation going to change?
Well, the situation is, as I was mentioning, is a tricky one. So I think one option, and we're living for the time being in the world of options. So one option would be that there is a transitional agreement, and my suggestion to the UK is maintain the same type of preferences that developing countries, and in particular the countries that have EPAs, but also others, have with the EU, and do that at least in a transitional period. What you want to avoid is to have suddenly an increase in your level of protection, to then negotiate and 2 or 5 years later to be able again to decrease your level of protection. So my suggestion will be for the UK to ask for WTO waiver and extend the preferential trade regime that the EU is providing to developing countries, giving them the time to negotiate and adjust formal free trade agreements between the UK and these EPA countries. And that again will take time. So the notion that it could be negotiated in 1 or 2 days or 6 months, the economic partnership agreements negotiations have taken years to come up. So I think that this transitional arrangement is where the focus should be.
Do you think that in the long run, the developing countries are going to be worse off with the new situation, or is it likely to going to be similar?
Well, the signs so far we hear, and the pressure we hear from what's happening in the UK, is that the UK is normally kind of free trader type of country, has been always in the context of the economic partnership agreements very vocal about the need to have development-friendly agreements. So in the long run, in that sense, one could be optimistic. In practice, however, that might turn out to be quite difficult. First, because you have vested interests that might be different also from the UK, willing to protect some of their markets. The second dimension is that the relationship that the UK will have with the EU is very important. So by the fact that the UK is leaving the EU markets, that is a kind of market segmentation. So the flow of goods of developing countries in the regions might be affected. And that is something that developing countries will not have a direct impact on. So I think it is important also when the EU and the UK negotiate that they think about what is the implication for third countries, and that the UK is not trying to be as original as possible, but builds on what is happening on the EU so that there is a smoother transition. So these are elements. The third one is the question of regional integration. That we've heard the UK willing to sign a free trade agreement with Nigeria or with Kenya, and we know these are exactly the problems that in economic partnership agreements we have. That the EU wanted to sign regional agreements with West Africa, could not, is having now with the interim EPAs with the Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, but this is splitting the region. So this puts the EU at odds with what the regional dynamics are taking place. So there, the UK will be confronted exactly with the same problems as what the EU have been confronted with. And so the notion that we'll simply sign free trade deals without preferred partners, and that will happen immediately, is not an obvious one. The last point, of course, is that I'm not sure that negotiating with some of the poorest or less advanced developing countries will be a priority for the UK. And so to which extent and how fast they can set up new trade relationship with developing countries would also be put to the test.